Some time ago, Bennett Cerf told a story of the freshman in college who, for his first English literature paper, was to write on the Shakespearean character Othello. And he handed in the paper, and when it came back, it had an A on it, got an A grade. But underneath the A was written, "Please make an appointment to talk to me," from the professor. So wondering what that was about, he did make the appointment. He was greeted and taken into the office of the professor, and they had a nice chat about the topics and English literature, and then finally they got around to the paper, and he said, "Do you happen to belong to a particular fraternity? Do you belong to a certain fraternity?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Do they still have that file of the old papers and tests?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I wrote that paper." So the student was kind of baffled on what next to do, but finally he said, "Why did you give me an A?" He said, "Well, when I handed the paper in as a student, I only got a C+, and I always thought it was worth an A." Now, this is the ethical problem we're dealing with. Ethics can be pretty dry, but it's really what I would like you to do this morning is kind of walk with me. I personally came to ethics from the standpoint of a Boy Scout with the laws, the oath, and then, of course, I had... Sorry. Off again? Okay. Sorry about that. All right. Let's take the plan. It was, for me, it was either from my youth as a Boy Scout type of thing, or, in that day, why my parents had certain requirements of me, and they would even move to corporal punishment, if necessary, to get my attention. But then as I became a lawyer, why the focus of ethics really moved into the area of professional ethics, the rules written down for lawyers to keep from getting disbarred and such as that. And so it was kind of a provincial start that I had in thinking about ethics at all. It wasn't a broad, general thought of every aspect of my life. Now, as I came further, though, I realized how provincial that was. And I also realized that for some reason, ethics was just kind of getting a lip service in the area. And I started thinking about that and reading about it. And finally it came to my attention that this country, starting with what we called the Age of Enlightenment, started moving away from Western traditional moral values as being the rules. Science was coming upon the scene. You can imagine when science breaks loose and proves this is not a flat earth. And the whole idea is shaking people. And so at the same time that science is making great strides, philosophy is trying to keep up with it, and together philosophy and science thought they would be the answer to human needs. And we came into the modern age of great optimism of where the world was going to go. The thing that happened at that time, though, was the aspects that had come down through the centuries, mostly through the church, were kind of put on the shelf. Now, when I speak of church, I want to make sure you know what I'm talking about. I am not talking about a particular denomination or particular building or anything like that. I'm talking about that huge group of people who have spiritual values that they follow under what we call a Christian faith. Now, again, with that term, it can be a buzzword. I'm not talking about historical or current failures of some, nor am I talking about any kind of dogma that is fierce and judgmental. What I'm talking about is the precepts that came to these people of love, kindness, consideration, justice, mercy, compassion. Those rules, I think we can all agree, are rules or basic understandings of morals that we can all live with, irrespective of what our faith may be. So what happened, though, was as this movement away from those standard moral basics, which had been taught not only in the church but in secular education of all kinds, and it was pretty much the accepted, this society, Western society, started moving away from that. Now, the point is made most strongly in a report that was made by, in a 1986 and 7 annual report from President Bach of Harvard University. Now listen to these words as he speaks. Religious institutions no longer seem as able as they once were to impart basic values to the young. In these circumstances, universities, including Harvard, need to think hard about what they can do in the face of what many perceive as a widespread decline in ethical standards. In other days, the instructor's aim was to foster a belief in commonly accepted moral values. Today's course in applied ethics does not seek to convey a set of moral truths, but tries to encourage the student to think carefully about complex moral issues. Now, what you hear there is a disconnect between ethics and moral truths. So when he goes on, he explains that really the universities not only don't feel it's their place to teach moral basic truths, but they have dropped it completely. And so moral development in the college years thus centers on the shift from moral ideology to ethical responsibility. Now, how can you do that? You see the separation there. Moral ideology, in other words, that's old-fashioned stuff. That's back in those funny days in the Middle Ages. What we're talking about here is trying to find out how we ought to act. Well, the answer to that, of course, is how do you know how to act if you don't have something undergirding it as a moral value? That's the point. So when a teacher then has a student hand in a grade that says, or a paper that says that Columbus discovered America in 1500, he can address that or she can address that with a particular grade. But what if the student comes along and says discrimination is okay, and you haven't ever taught them that it's not okay? Then how do you grade them there? What happens then is this individuality in teaching just kind of moves past the ethical, moral basis we're looking for. Well, President Bach went on hoping that the colleges would do something about that, and he was talking about the thing that brought it to his mind was the lack of ethics in business communities, and he was in the 86, 87 years. Think if he'd been talking in the 90s decade. You see how this has developed. All right, so what my point is, I think we all have to come to something that is the basis of our moral or of our ethical practices. Morals are the principles, ethics are the practice, and that's what we need to keep in our heads. All right, now myself, my moral basis I find in my faith. I wasn't always so. I was 40 years old before I started really paying any attention to a solid faith, and I've been working at it ever since to try and figure it all out and to practice it. But it has given me this solid basis from which I make ethical decisions or put out moral principles. Everybody has to find where their source is. Now, my source comes out of those same standards of fairness, justice, mercy, compassion, love. Those are the root moral principles that I go by. Well, some people would move you much past that, and to some extent, and I can quote to you a scientist who says, we really don't have any moral hinges or boundaries or anything like that, because all we are is just bags of chemical reactions. Now, if that's satisfactory to you, that you're just a bag of chemical reactions, why we're not, but I don't think that's what this group believes. You're something more. There's something within you that speaks to you about what is right and wrong. You have your self-respect. You have the desire to have contact with other people that is fruitful for both of you. Now, a fellow by the name of Spitzer, who is the president of Gonzaga University, wrote a book called The Spirit of Leadership. Incredibly good book, and it goes through all aspects of leadership in business, and it has a marvelous chapter on ethics. In that point, he brings up the attention that one of the basic principles that has come to us over the centuries we call the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Comes out of the book of Matthew. Now, Spitzer says that doesn't always work in business. If you do unto others as you would want them to do, well, then you give away your product and so forth. That doesn't practical. But its application in business is more in what you do in relationship to partners, stockholders, people of interest in the business, and what the business does in the community to bring aid to the community. And I think one of the things that's most overlooked is the gigantic contribution that business makes to really wonderful causes in the community. That's giving. That's golden rule type of thing. But there's a second rule, and it's called the silver rule. Don't do unto others as you would not want them to do unto you. You see, it's stated negatively, but here's what it really means when he boils it down. Avoid jeopardizing the life and safety of others. In other words, you don't jeopardize somebody's life and safety. You avoid infringing upon another person's custody over his person or actions unless he is threatening others. Avoid stealing, avoid cheating, avoid exploiting the vulnerable and the helpless. Avoid breaking your word, either by lying or by breaking a promise or a trust. Now you can kind of hear 10 commandments, not all of them, but coming out of that source you can hear that reasoning. The Uncle Eric books written by Richard Mayberry, I don't know if any of you have seen any of them. They're kind of interesting books. He has 2 rules that he writes to his nephew about. Do all things you have agreed to do, in other words, keep your promises, and do not encroach on other persons or their property. It's really a pretty good summary of the ones that Spitzer puts down. But that's how we act. So then every time you make a move, a business decision, a personal decision and such, you start asking these questions. Am I jeopardizing somebody? Am I infringing upon somebody? Could this lead to taking away from a shareholder their fair share? That sort of thing. And when you get there, and then if you get this uncomfortable feeling that really, I'm not sure that kind of sounds right, or that doesn't feel good to me, well, then I think you need to have somebody you turn to, a spouse, a friend, an old colleague, a partner, business associate, and you say, let me bounce this one off of you. How does it sound to you? And if it doesn't ring right, well, then you know it's not going well. Now, what this shows to us is these decisions are not always black and white. You can have varied principles coming in. Let's just take mercy and justice. prophet Micah said, "What does the Lord require of you, O man, but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before your God?" Now, how do you do justice in my job? How do I do justice, and how do I use mercy? If I'm required to sentence somebody to a certain term of incarceration, where does mercy come into that? Or is everybody who comes in front of me just a figure, one like another grain of wheat? No, they're different, and so they have to be treated different. So these different principles sometimes come in conflict with one another. And what that means is that you and I kind of fall into a combination of two groups. A deontologist, D-E-O-N, D-E-O-N-tologist, deontologist. That's the guy who's black and white. This is right or it's wrong. The other one is a utilitarian. It's a term that was started by John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher. And here comes in the weighing of the benefits against the costs. Now watch how this works in our society. When I was young, the thought of a state lottery was anathema. Deontological decision. Today, we weigh what we might gain from it in adding to the public coffers against the dangers of an addiction to gambling, and that weighing is being made all the time. And our society utilitarianly decided we ought to have a lottery. Now, we have to watch that kind of thing. We can't be the strictest of deontologists, nor can we be the wildest of the utilitarian, because that utilitarian can rationalize almost anything, and that's where rationalism comes in. The deontologist has very hard trouble. Our literature in the world is really a great help to us, and you're acquainted with the book Les Miserables, and in there we have all of these characters. We have the judge who sentences Jean Valjean to the galleys. That's just a cruel sentence. There's no mercy in that at all. For stealing a loaf of bread, he's sent to the galleys for life. After he escapes, why then he is hounded by Javert, the police officer, for years and years. Javert is after him and never can quite catch him, and finally he even commits suicide. He's so disappointed. And there's the deontologist. He wanted to have the law enforced. Then there was the Bishop of Digne, who took Valjean in, and when he wasn't looking, Valjean stole these beautiful silver candlesticks and took off and was caught by the police, brought back to the bishop's home, and so here's Jean Valjean standing there in front of him, and the police say, "Did he steal these from you?" And he said, "No, I gave them to him." Now you saw the mercy come in. And as a reader thing, that's the movement that is made there. And it's very, very important that we watch what we're doing when we have that kind of movement. I know that I make shifts. That doesn't mean it's a sliding scale. What I like to think is that one principle overcomes another one. When I first started practicing law, it was absolutely illegal to advertise as an attorney. You were disbarred out of hand. Now the yellow pages are full of attorneys advertising. Were we wrong once and right once, or what is that? Or did we make a shift to this utilitarian aspect? Because the idea is that in order to bring freer access to attorneys, why allow them to advertise so people know where they are? I don't think that was a big difficulty before, and I don't have a lot of trust in artfully crafted ads as setting forth the standard of who's a good lawyer or who isn't. But it's now part of the practice, and we have to think, what are we doing when we do that? Well, what we're doing is we're often just saying, I don't have an anchor here. I don't know how to look at this. I don't have that basic rule. And so then I start waffling on where I go with a particular issue. And you become more and more utilitarian, even though you like to think you're principled and you like to think I have ethics in my profession and such. You really have to be careful. So the deontologist should always give way to human dignity and compassion. The utilitarian should give way to the avoidance of any action that just fulfills a personal desire at the expense of someone else. To do that, you really have to go back to this silver rule and say, count down through the ways. What am I really doing here? We're all both deontologists and utilitarians. Look for the basic principle that controls. When we think of Katrina and the people who looted stores because they were literally starving, does justice control there, or is there another principle that comes on top of that? If Clinton lied and Bush lied, is there a severity problem? What is the standard by which we judge either person? It's a very, very slippery slope if you don't anchor yourself with some real basic moral values. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions this morning, so if you have any questions for Judge Marsh. And also, if you'd like to stay afterwards, he'll be hanging around to answer questions as well on a one-on-one basis. So any questions?
Excuse me, when you said what controls, are you talking about what are your motives?
Yes.
Let me repeat the question. The question was, when you said what controls, what are your motives?
Yeah, it is your motives. This nation started out with a new thought process socially, and that was independence. Each person was to be independent in their thinking about anything. Now, if that, and Thomas Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness. You've all heard that. Well, that was only half the quote that he was making from a fellow by the name of Francis Hutcheson, who said, the pursuit of happiness is bringing happiness to others. But the way it came to us is the pursuit of happiness is our right. And so then our personal motives, but that's my right, you see. And you get hung up on what's good for me. And so if you start moving only in what's good for you, without looking at the effect it has on others, then you really start moving toward hedonism or nihilism or something like that that can be outrageous. That's where Nietzsche was taking us in the 19th century when he said, God is dead, so you don't have any rules. Just go at it. And so it's a very, very good question. It is within us. And you can't ever say, the devil made me do it. That's not going to work. So, okay.
It seems that we're seeing a decline in corporation ethics since the fall of 2001 when the Enron scandal corporations that are enforcing company-based ethics training. And recently it was CNN announced that Washington government is getting 3,000 of their employees through that corporation-based ethics training. Is this because we're seeing a decline in our society, or is this just because it's being popularized recently?
I believe.
Repeat the question. Okay, this is going to be hard to summarize here, but basically there's been a rise in ethics training, and one of the questions was, is that a result, mentioning Enron as a specific example, is that a result in the decline of values in our society? Is that a fair statement?
All right, let me take the Bar Association. For the last decade at least, they have continuing legal education programs. You are required, every lawyer in the state is required to take so many hours of legal ethics. Now that's good, but what are those ethics hooked to? What basic principle are they upholding? Because as I said, those ethics change. We do different things now as attorneys ethically than they used to be able to do ethically. So I think training is good, but it needs to be undergirded by the very thing that President Bach was talking about. If you're not going to teach what undergirds an ethical decision, if it doesn't have a moral principle it's based on, then it can be anywhere. There's nothing to hook it to, and the wind is going to take those ethics all over the map, and it'll ignore the fact of deontology and utilitarian. It will just go off the charts. So neither applies. So, yep. Back there further.
Okay. I was curious your comment about the Harvard president, and he was saying, well, we don't have, we can't rely on Judeo-Christian moral background, so we have to use some other method. Does that relate to maybe what Greek philosophers attempted to do to try to get some, that there were some ultimate truths out there, and so through logic we'll determine what these were?
Absolutely. Socrates never wrote a thing. He just taught, and the only person who wrote down what he taught was Plato. But he was searching for truth, and what he was confronting was a group then known in Greek days of that time, 500 BC, were called the Sophists. They were sophisticated. They called themselves the Sophists, and they prided themselves upon their intellect. And Socrates took them to task. No. It isn't how smart you are. It's how truthful you are. And so that battle has been going on ever since. The Gnostics were the next that said, we know all truth. No, you don't know all truth. And it's come down through us in one form or another over the centuries. And there are great minds out there in philosophy that have made great studies of this, and there are absolute nitwits out there. So you can find any answer you want. So, yes.
This will be the last question.
I'm not sure what kind of cases you hear in your court. Is it you do criminal stuff in your court as well? How has the sentencing laws, where you're given boundaries to sentence, how do you feel that's impacted your ability as a judge to do the mercy justice balance?
Do I have till noon? I'm against the sentencing guidelines, have always been against the sentencing guidelines. And in the modern time, with all this flap about interviewing judges for the position on the Supreme Court, when I first came on the bench, it was judicial discretion. A couple of years later, the sentencing guidelines hit, and I was told how I was to sentence people. This is why everybody became fungible at that time. It was just what score you got, that's how much time you did. Ridiculous way to do it. I always felt they were unconstitutional, but I applied them. That was my oath, to apply the law. It wasn't my oath to make the law. Now, in the last year, they've declared portions of them unconstitutional. So they're saying they're advisory only. Now, that opens the door to more discretion, which I think is proper, but it is still there. It is still something you're supposed to look at, and so many judges are just going lockstep along, doing it the way they've always done it under the guidelines. Reading into its advisory only far, far too little. And so it's a hard place. I think sentencing is the hardest thing a judge has to, I know it is for me. It's the hardest thing we have to do. I've given life sentences. I've given probation. I've given everything in between. And none of them are easy. I'm against the death penalty. And I just prayed throughout my whole time until senior status when I could say, no, I won't take this case or that case, that I would never get a death penalty case, because that would have been a hard place for me to be. And so you raise a very good point. It's very, very difficult, and it's the most difficult part of our job. Yeah.
Thank you very much.